when it comes to the results on a very broad level, and this is, in some ways kind of vague, but I think it does give a little bit of a picture of the general experience of people with virtual or self-reps with virtual hearings. So on average, or kind of roughly 24% of our respondents indicated that they were overall satisfied with their virtual hearing experience. 35% reported they were dissatisfied, and 50%, yeah, it was fairly significant. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Percent that they were neither satisfied nor dissatisfied. So I guess kind of neutral
Right.
there. So in the end, what we had, and I'll go a little bit further into this, but from our perspective, what we were seeing is, and that's partly why we talk about this being a complex portrait, because there were a lot of people who talked about a lot of positives, that this was, as we kind of initially thought when this first happened in the pandemic, there are a lot of positives for a lot of people in a lot of circumstances. It absolutely is an increase in access to justice to be able to participate virtually in a court hearing. But then a lot of people in different situations and in different contexts have not so positive experiences. And there's a lot of issues there that we think need to be addressed. And, we'll get kind of into our recommendations a little bit later, but kind of broadly speaking, and it was interesting because some of the, I guess, initial comments or things that we had from justice system insiders when they heard we were doing this study was a kind of knee-jerk assumption that we were going to say that virtual hearings are just uniformly bad and that we shouldn't be doing them, and that's not our stance at all. I think to begin with, I think they're not going anywhere. I don't think this is something that is going to be reversed, nor do I think it should be. I think it's another step, another kind of tool in the toolkit of ways that people can participate in court. And that's, I think, ultimately a good thing, but we're certainly arguing that I think there are better or worse ways to kind of go about it, and that it needs to be done in a nuanced way, and that context matters, and that it shouldn't also be the be all end all, that, we need to basically provide different options as much as we possibly can for different circumstances. So again, kind of broadly speaking, I'll talk about some of the positives that people talked about in their experiences. So a lot of people talked about they liked that there was less time traveling to and from court, and going with that, you don't have to pay for parking fees, you're not spending money on gas, all these kinds of things. And for a lot of people, if the court is some distance away from them, that can be pretty significant.
That's right.
Yeah, less time kind of sitting around a courthouse waiting to be heard. A lot of people talked about feeling like what they experienced was kind of less formal and less intimidating, and therefore less stressful to kind of sit at home in front of their own computer or device and participate that way, as opposed to being in, an intimidating courtroom. Some people talked about they found, at least in their virtual hearing experience, that the rules were a little relaxed, and that also made them feel less stressed and more confident. People talked about really appreciating that they could arrange their materials and have in front of them whatever they needed or wanted, and set up exactly how they liked. One person actually talked about having, she said she had two monitors in front of her, one, for the Zoom call, and one with her documents. And, that's great that she had the ability to do that. And it definitely, she felt it really made a difference for her. And then another big and important consideration is that for some people, they felt safer participating virtually. And I think, and we actually saw at least one other previous study talk about this issue of, for victims of intimate partner violence, a virtual hearing can be a real positive, because it's, again, it's just a safety issue, and you feel more comfortable, more confident, or at least some people do in that context, as opposed to having to be in person with, with somebody who has abused you. So those were kind of in a nutshell the broad positives, and as I say, a significant proportion, almost 25% of our respondents said they were very satisfied with virtual hearings for those reasons. But then, kind of getting into some of the experiences on the opposite end of that spectrum, some of the negatives, As you can imagine, one of the biggest things is tech challenges, and there's kind of two sides to that. The first being um, the litigant themselves not feeling familiar or comfortable with the technology. So I think, for some of us, it's easy to forget that not everybody is used to a Zoom meeting, especially in the early days of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And even now, like that's not a regular part of everybody's kind of daily life or job.
Right.
So for a lot of people, especially when you're thinking about perhaps older people, or as I say, people who it's just not part of their career, um, that's kind of it's adding a layer of discomfort and unfamiliarity on top of a process that they're already uncomfortable and not familiar with. Um, and then just literally the question of access. So we talk a lot in the report about the digital divide, which we really found illustrated in the responses. People talking about not having, whether they didn't have an appropriate device at all. I think a
Mm.
lot of people, are perhaps appearing on their phone, if they don't have a laptop or a tablet or access to one of those devices. And I mean, I think anybody you can imagine that trying to appear on court, on your mobile phone is not as comfortable as it would be to have a bigger device in front of you.
Yeah.
And then the access of Wi-Fi, of course. There's still, most people have access to Wi-Fi, but still not everybody does in this country. And that's presuming that everybody has access to good, strong, reliable Wi-Fi, which not everybody does. There are plenty of pockets all over the country that even if you have Wi-Fi, it might not be great Wi-Fi.
That's
And
right.
that's,
That's true.
yeah, and that's a barrier right there. Um, and then the issue of technical challenges kind of from the end of the courts themselves. And I
Mm.
think, because of the kind of ad hoc way that courts dove into virtual hearings because of the pandemic. They just kind of, quickly moved online as a way to keep going, understandably.
Right.
But I think, of course, that that leads to, not always the smoothest processes, or, not everybody, even on the court side, judges included, perhaps being particularly comfortable with software. And I think, the longer things have gone on, the less excuse there is from the courts to have things sorted in that way, and to make sure that as much as possible things are running smoothly, and that everybody on their end knows what they're doing and is comfortable. And I'm not saying that that isn't happening. I know that it is, but we really found that it's still wildly uneven in courts across the country. And then just the issue of technical support. So it is kind of inevitable. We've all experienced, even in the best, most tested out, most familiar virtual environments, things go wrong, access gets disrupted, whatever. But we were hearing from a lot of people that they weren't finding that there was either any or adequate tech support from the court. Um, some people brought up the issue that whereas at an in-person hearing, they would have been allowed to have a support person or a Mackenzie friend, which is something that we really advocate for, that self-reps, if they possibly can, should ask for.
Hmm.
Um, and so a lot of people were finding that they were being denied having a support person in the virtual context. And then that led to kind of the conversation about, well, other forms of assistance that are traditionally there at an in-person courtroom don't necessarily exist in the virtual setting, things like duty counsel. And I think some courts have figured out how to provide that, but not all, and it's kind of still this gray area. And then the big issue that we heard about a lot was people's issue with not being comfortable knowing who everybody was in the Zoom, whether people, when they got on the call, not everybody who was in the room was being introduced, people not being kind of labeled, they're not having their name and their title displayed. Some people having cameras turned off, so not knowing who they were, and just the issue of not knowing who else might be listening in. So who might be, uh, yeah, listening in, I guess, whether in the room with somebody else or via their own login with their camera turned off or whatever. So all of this leads to confusion and distrust and people, issues of audio problems, issues with people talking over each other. And a lot of litigants talked about feeling confused about, okay, who is speaking? Who is this person? I don't know. Is this the lawyer? Is this somebody else? So just a lot of confusion, and I say again, a lot of kind of distrust and fear that, safety. So is their privacy being respected? Who is on this call? And then the issue of where people are participating from. So not everybody has a safe, private, quiet, comfortable place from which to participate in a court hearing virtually. People talked about appearing, from noisy environments at home with their kids running around because that was the only place they could call in from. People talked about calling in from their cars, or one person actually talked about calling in from a boat. So people, yeah, it can't be assumed that everybody has a quiet, kind of professional looking office or space from which to participate. And then finally, a big thing that came up that we weren't really expecting, but it makes a lot of sense. We heard a lot of people talking about disliking appearing via telephone, and that kind of would fall into two categories. People who sometimes, if it was a fully audio or a fully telephone hearing, or we heard from people a lot who talked about they didn't have the option for whatever reason to appear kind of virtually and had to call in to a Zoom or a Teams meeting or whatever, just audio only. And they spoke about feeling really out of it in that circumstance, and that really ups the ante in not knowing who is speaking, who everybody is, feeling like you can't, that you're being talked over, that you are not kind of being given as much consideration or weight as other people in the hearing. So kind of in a nutshell, those were the main themes we were hearing in terms of both positives and negatives. But some of the correlations that we were kind of seeing, which we found very interesting, and really, when you think about it, pretty unsurprising, that access really makes a difference. So there was definitely a correlation between people reporting that they had a positive experience with their virtual hearing and their level of access to Wi-Fi, as well as their previous experience with the platform. So it makes sense, right? If somebody has a better setup, a better Wi-Fi connection, if they are already familiar with the platform, they'll probably be more likely to have a better experience. And then privilege as well makes a difference. So in terms things like higher income level, higher education levels tended to be correlated with higher satisfaction with virtual hearings, which again, unsurprising, but I think it really illustrates who kind of tends to fall through the cracks in these situations. And it unfortunately seems to be a lot of the people who generally tend to fall through the cracks in our society. And there's a sizable proportion of these people who are, just as in many ways kind of in the in-person virtual or the in-person court system, are experiencing higher levels of barriers when it comes to virtual processes as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I want to just kind of speak to the digital divide because I also made the same, like, yeah, I also made the same mistake of kind of assuming, oh, everybody has a laptop, everybody has Zoom, everybody's got the most up-to-date operating system.
Yeah.
And I know that some of my my older friends who are retired, and they don't need a laptop, they don't need to update to the latest
No,
software.
and their
Yeah,
careers
they're
that
gonna
didn't
be
necessarily involve, yeah, so they're not
yeah, it's
familiar.
going to be so hard for them. And I know what you mean. I think like most people do have a cell phone, but not everybody would have a laptop or that tablet, or especially the up-to-date equipment that
Exactly.
lawyers are, well, we have to, because we're
Absolutely.
working. But then, yes, it's really easy to forget that.